Greetings, friends! Juan Yusuke here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of October 21st to October 27th of 2024. And this week we have a lot of updates, specifically in the Pokrovsk South Donetsk direction. And let's get right into it. And the biggest, the highlight, the star of the show this week is the complete collapse and fall of the city of Selidovo. We've been talking about how the Russians have been slowly, pushing, they were, moving up along this rail line towards Vyshana. They've been moving to the west from Novy-Gorivka across these fields, trying to reach this intersection right here. And, I was like, eventually they're going to try to, squeeze the Ukrainians out of here. But, when we left off last week, the Russians were, they were, reaching here, they were here. But they were just about like right here or so. They weren't, and everything else here was under Ukrainian control. But now everything, Selidovo has completely collapsed within a few days, and it was pretty impressive because, at first, I thought like, okay, when the Russians started their offensive in Selidovo, we started getting reports that the Russians were moving, across these areas right here. They reached this mining area here. But I'm like, that makes sense because the Ukrainians aren't guarding these residential areas. Their main defense was in these high-rise buildings right here. And so even if the Russians were moving across here, right? I'm like, okay, it makes sense that they would be moving here easily. But once they reach here, they'd be stopped. But that didn't happen. They after, so they had that one-day offensive and then the second day, we started seeing Russian flags being raised here, and then over the next few days, we started seeing more Russian troops being in this central Selidovo, and now the cleanup is in process. They took the center a few days ago, and now basically the western part was getting cleared this weekend, and that has been officially been done by the end of this week. Now, the Russians have to clear this up. It was a pretty big fall, and from the looks of it, they actually captured it pretty much intact, almost like Novy-Gorivka here. They don't have to raise every single city to the ground like they did before. And so, they could actually use this as a good place of operations for further expansion. So the fall of Selidovo is a very big deal. It is another, they could use this as a stopping off point to continue expanding to reach the southern part of Pokrovsk. You could say that the capture of Novy-Gorivka allowed them to reach the southern part of Minigrad, but to reach the southern part of Pokrovsk, they had to take Selidovo. And this will probably and we also have confirmation that we actually got this today, is that the Russians have raised their flag in Vyshana. So this village, which was one of the last hubs that helped prevent a complete collapse of the Ukrainians in Selidovo, was captured. So we actually have something like this. And my prediction is that the Russians will be using this rail line. You can see this rail line that runs to Pokrovsk here. This rail line right here. The Russians are going to continue moving north, and they're also going to continue pushing from the east here. And my prediction is that they're going to try to make a continuous front line with Novy-Gorivka. So they're going to try to take Suchka Yar, Daksevsky, and kind of have the front line. Let me rewrite this here. Have the front line be something like this. And they're going to, continue moving northwards. They're going to continue moving eastwards and capture this area in the next coming weeks. And then this way, they'll have a more continuous front along Pokrovsk and also have their western flanks protected with the rail line. And so, yeah, the collapse. There's not much. They captured this giant hill. There was a complete collapse of the Selidovo garrison. And who knows? Maybe because the Russians already were on three sides of it, and maybe it was just a matter of time. But, at least even in, Avdiivka, when it was surrounded on three sides, it gave up a big fight for a few months. But once the Russians entered Selidovo, it was pretty much game over. So, Selidovo Vyshana has been taken. And now we're going to see the Russians, I believe, continue moving northwards. But I think, now, here's the thing, though, is that the Russians aren't actually going to be focusing on Pokrovsk. I don't think that's going to be the focus, at least it looks like the Russian command has now moved their attention to the south Donetsk direction, which we'll talk about in a moment here. So I don't think they'll continue. I think they're going to, still move in this direction somewhat, as I mentioned before. But I don't think they're going to continue moving towards Pokrovsk, at least at the moment. They're going to eventually do this, obviously, but I don't think the Russian command has their focus on Pokrovsk at this very moment. I do think that They're just going to try to flatten the front line in this area to like kind of, because then the Russians will have these three these three areas as like their own defense line as they as logistics hubs as they push towards Pokrovsk and Minograd. But that's for a future date. I don't think they're going to continue pushing towards Pokrovsk. They're actually going to be pushing in the South Donetsk direction towards Karakova and try to basically clean up this entire South Donetsk area. I think that's, instead of the Pokrovsk direction, where we're going to actually see most of the fighting for this winter campaign will be in the South Donetsk direction. But let's continue talking about the Pokrovsk direction here. These, as I mentioned, like for the last few weeks, each of these areas support each other. Now, when I talk about these different front lines, they're not completely separate entities. They work together in tandem. Russian success in Ukrainsk and Selidova and Gernik helps Russian success, in the Karakova direction. So, very big gains in Selidova, but let's continue talking about some other things. The Russians are also pushing across this rail line, which actually was really surprising. And, we talked about the complete capture of Tuskria last week, but they actually have continued pushing along and have captured all these fields in this week. So they've been pushing along, and they are trying to reach the village of Novodorminivka here. And also, they're also now pushing along this rail line and trying to take the village of Kremina Balka, which is not really a village, I don't think. I think it's like one of those things that says it's a village on the map, but when you look in, there's like literally nothing there. I mean, there's like some little houses here, I guess. But yeah, they're, again, moving along the rail line to the south here to try to cut off the Ukrainian garrisons in Karakokivka. But they're also moving to the north here. And I think what they're going to try to do is, cut off Karakova from the west here, and they're gonna, right now they've reached the outskirts of Novodormivka here. We could see them capturing the first few houses on the eastern outskirts here, and I think in the next week or so they're going to capture it. And I think that after that they're going to continue. There's like a river here, I think. Let's see, that they could use. The Staritskia River, and I think that's what they're going to try to move along the rail line, move along this river, and take Zoria, take Sontiska, and then reach Staria Terni, and then once they reach capture this area, then they could start putting under fire. The Ukrainians have a river here, so they could have a bit of to secure this highway that helps supply the Karakova garrison, but everything to the north of the Vuchka River Reservoir will be taken by the Russians in November, I believe. So, this entire area will be captured by the Russians in November, and then, the Russians are obviously making progress in the south here, and Karakova will probably be one of the biggest gains for the Russians in the next coming month or so. So, yeah, lots of gains towards Novodormivka, towards Kremina Balka, and they're just expanding everywhere. I believe that this will become like a Selidova flower, and we're going to see a lot of gains, perhaps. Now, where the Russians are also making a big push, and this was a very big, I was kind of surprised, we've been talking about how the Russians have been trying to close the Gernik-Karakivka pocket for a while now, but they have been having some trouble here. Well, it looks like the Russians are said, fuck it, we are just going to go storm Gernik itself, and Gernik has basically completely fallen. We saw the Russians raise their flag in the middle of Gernik, and we also have the Russians raising their flags in Islamivka here. So we actually got confirmation that the village of Islamivka has fallen, and basically that the city of Gernik has fallen, which is actually very surprising. The Ukrainians could have held on to this for a while, but they decided not to. Maybe attrition's finally having its hold, but we'll see. Now, Gernik will that was completely surprising. I thought, I'm like, why storm it directly when you could surround it? But it looks like they were breaking their backs against this area. So when the Russians started pushing into Gernik and captured at least the northern part of Gernik, they were able to capture Ismailivka, and from there they are now actually entering the eastern part of Novoselidovivka. This was a place where the Russians were trying to capture the last 2 weeks now, and they've been having a hard time trying to capture it. But now with the capture of when they captured half of Gernik, and they were in the center of it, they were able to start advancing across it in two sides and capture this village, and then now they've been able to enter Novoselidovivka here. And then with the capture of this village, this will basically, it's just fields before they reach the last roads that help supply the Karakivka garrison here. So yeah, it's a lot. The fall of Garanik. I mean, that's a fucking big deal, my dudes. I mean, like I I mean, I was kind of surprised. Now, it's not like the thing is that now these areas basically will just the capture this isn't like it's a good capture, but it's not like it will lead to more like it's not as important as Selidova because Selidova allows them to like use that as base of operations to expand to the southern part of all these villages in the south of Pokrovsk. Garanik and Kharkivka are good prizes for all the gains the Russians have made during this fall campaign, and so with the Russians advancing in the north and in the south here and cutting things off here. This was just a matter of time, and now the Russians, with the capture of these two big towns, the Russians will be able to start encircling Karakova from the north here, which is basically what the main purpose of taking these two towns are. So Garanik has fallen. The main clashes at the moment are for this mining. This is like one of the high rise, kind of like the high ground here. So the Russians are trying to storm this mining thing, which is part of Garanik. So it's technically Garanik is only about 90% taken, but most of the residential area and the high rise buildings have been taken, and the fields around it. And so now they're battling for this mine. The other area that has a high ground is this mine right here, which is for Kharkivka. So these are the two mines that help protect the Ukrainians here. And if the Russians could take this one mine, then this will give them the advantage of probably just. I don't think they're going to try to storm Kharkivka. Maybe they will, but I think they're going to just try to take Novoselivka and then push southwards here and try to take Bersky and Ilinivka, and then have the Ukrainians in Kharkivka be cut off completely. So or who knows? They stormed Garanik, and I didn't expect that. So maybe once they capture this, they'll try to like do some sort of like maybe pincer attack and take Kharkivka and make a small encirclement there or something. Also, the Russians have completely taken the town of Zorina here, which was very surprising. It's on the other side of the Voshka River, and I thought, the Russians aren't going to cross this river, but they did. And we actually have the Russians raising their flags there, so this village has been taken. This probably was what helped facilitate the capture of Garanik, because this happened earlier in the week. And so I think with the capture of Zorina and, taking these fields to the north here, and, the Russians were able to make some sort of, attack that were able to complicate the supply for Garanik, which led to its fall. Zorina fell, also the village of Alexandropol, which was the last Ukrainian bridgehead on the other side of the Voshka River. So everything on the western side or on the eastern side of this river has been taken. So this village has been taken by the Russians. And now Kharkivka has this river to defend itself, but I mean, the Russians are right in the northern outskirts of it. It's right in the eastern part of it. The Ukrainians are going to have to give up the city very soon. So, lots of gains for the Russians in the Pokrovsk direction. The fall of Garanik, the fall of Selidova. This was a big gain for the Russians this week. And we shall see how the Russians develop. Right now, the focus for this area is to take probably something like this. This will be the goal of the Russians for the next few weeks or so. This is what the Russians want to take. And then in the north, so if we kind of scroll out here, what the Russians will focus on for the next, probably for November, is they're going to try to take this area, and they're going to try to take this area generally. So this is where the Russians will focus. And once they do this, then I think they're going to then continue focusing on the south here, continue trying to clear Karakovo, which will be what I think, and the Russians, based on the current pace, have a good chance of taking this by the end of the year, which will be a very big prize for the Russians. So we shall see. So, and then as I mentioned, we're not going to go to the South Donetsk area, and this is also where the Russians have made big breakthroughs. And obviously, these are, it was pretty surprising because of the amount of land taken. Usually we talk about they took this tree line or they took this strong point, and this is how the kind of the gains go. But, so there's a bunch of big gains here, but they're not as sexy as the fall of Selidova or the fall of Garanik. We're talking about small villages here. So, but the amount of land taken is actually very significant this week. So the South Donetsk area, and again, this it goes in tandem with the Pokrovsk, at least the southern Pokrovsk direction here. And I think, a lot of rumors are swirling that the Russians are, their main focus is going to be to push in the kind of in between the Donetsk and Zaporozhye regions, and this is where the Russians are going to try to break through into kind of into the Dnipristic oblast itself, and probably try to encircle Velika Novosolivka and Galeopolia, and kind of have like a tidal wave so that they could push the Ukrainians away all the way up to Zaporozhye city itself, and have like the front line go something like this. Push the Ukrainians all the way to Zaporozhye. So maybe the Russians are trying to pull the entire front up just to secure their flanks more. So we shall see. But let's talk about the what's going on in the South Donetsk area, because this is where a lot of the big gains happen. Let's talk about the breakthrough in Bogdanovka. So the Russians have been slowly but surely moving north of Adana for the last few weeks now, and they captured this small fortress here. They were kind of like right here, but it was taking a very long time to reach Bogdanovka. But they made a big breakthrough. And today we have the flag being raised in the center part of Bogdanovka. And so basically the village of Bogdanovka has fallen to the Russians. This is a very big gain because the Russians were trying to basically, or the Ukrainians were trying to basically use Bogdanovka, Novoukrayinka, and Charkarsky to be the new defense line after the fall of Ugledar, and to link it with Velika Novosolivka. But if these three villages fall, then the Ukrainians are in much more wear for tear. Now the Ukrainians, according to a lot of sources, if you look at maps, you can see that they have a lot of defenses in the village of Uspenska. So they have a lot of defenses in the south of Karakova and Uspenska. So if the Russians want to move towards the south of Karakova from this direction, there's still a lot of defenses in the south of Karakova. But I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to focus to the west here. I think instead of moving towards Karakova, I think they're going to move to across these fields and try to reach the village of Andriivka and Konstantinivka, because if that that actually could work, because in that case when the Russians do their gains here, right, then they could actually link up, and then they could surround Karakova, and they could bypass the defenses in the south of Karakova here. So the Ukrainians want to keep the Russians as far away as possible from Karakova, from the Ugledar direction, and they were doing that with Bogdanovka, Novoukrayinka, and Charkarsky, but Bogdanovka has fallen. We have seen the Russians raise their flag here, but one of the biggest gains was the Russians breaking through towards Charkarsky, Novoukrayinka. Now, according to sources, these villages are still being contested. They are not completely fallen just yet, but we have seen Russians doing assault operations right on the outskirts of these two villages. And there are some sources saying that they've already been captured, but we don't have 100% confirmation of that just yet. But we saw basically the Russians push through from their two captured villages here and basically captured this entire all these fields here. This is a very big, usually in this war, if we scroll down here, so there's a bunch of tree, so it's like, okay, the Russians managed to maybe take this tree line, and then the next week they would have taken this tree line, and then the next week they might have taken this tree line, and then in the next week they might have reached these, these farms. But they did a big dash and captured a big chunk of territory. And a lot of sources are saying that they've actually reached the village of Charkarsky and have actually are battling for it. And also reached the outskirts of Novoukrayinka. And a lot of sources are saying that they've actually there's a lot more progress in Charkarsky, and then the Ukrainians in Novoukrayinka are actually falling back. Because, with the capture of Bogdanovka and progress in Charkarsky, they're going to be pincered and they're going to fall back anyway. And so we probably will expect the front line to go something like this in the next week or so. And then, the Russians will probably try to take these two villages here, cut off one of the main supply roads to Velika Novosolivka, and then they'll continue pushing, I think, along this road towards Rosalivka and Rosadolanova here, which will actually help, because then the Russians, if the Russians could reach these two villages, then they could actually start reaching, Konstantinivka, Bondarovka, and actually cut the Karakova highway. So that'd be a bad day for the Ukrainians here, especially if the Russians make good gains in the south of in the Garanik area. But also, this will actually facilitate the fall of Velika Novosilica, which will be a very big gain. And actually, the Russians are making a lot of big progress in this area as well, which we'll talk about in a moment here. But yeah, big progress, a lot of big breakthroughs here. The Ukrainians were able to anchor this after the fall of Ugledar for a few weeks, almost a month. They were able to basically hold this for October, but now they basically have fallen, and we're gonna have to see, with the fall of these villages, the Ukrainians still have good positions in the south of Uspensk, in Uspenska, in the south of Karakova, but I think after these, the Russians are going to focus southwest. That's my prediction. So we shall see. We also have some, let's continue talking about the South Donetsk area. The Russians have raised their flag in the farms of Katerinivka, and we have geolocated footage of the Russians being in the center of Katerinivka. A lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians have fled from this area, but looks like the fighting is still ongoing. Looks like there's still some pockets of resistance. The Russians are still on the outskirts of Antonovka, but with the capture of Katerinivka, I wouldn't be surprised if, basically the village of Antonovka is sealed once Katerinivka is taken. So they're continuing pushing in the south here just to secure their, because there's a lot of Ukrainians in this area, and if the Russians continue pushing here, then the Ukrainians that are here then could attack them on the flank here, and obviously they don't want that. So we shall see if how the progress goes in turn. So some small progress, and they're pushing here to support their offensive towards Karakova. We also have some pushes here. The Russians have fully secured themselves along this river here. They took Ostrovka 2 weeks ago, but they finally have cleared the cemetery and the fields here. They continue pushing to the east and south of Maslimanovka, which they captured last week. They captured this area, and they have captured some more fields here. So they're continuously pushing towards the eastern outskirts of Karakova. We also have some pushes here, trying to clear the fields between Grigorivka, Marninka, and Pobeba. We actually have some geolocated footage of the Russians doing offensive operations and taking these fields here. Just trying to, I guess, support the positions around these villages here. We also have geolocated footage of the Russians finally taking the last trenches and defenses along this road. The Ukrainians built a lot of defenses on this road because they wanted to hold it, but the Russians have captured it, and now they have a good supply between Marninka and Konstantinovka here. And the Russians will continue pushing along these fields. But these are very heavily trenchified fields. You might think, pushing through these fields are easy. It's not that easy. The Ukrainians have expected that the Russians will be pushing in this area, and so this entire area is actually heavily defended. So if I was the Russian command, I would be, obviously trying to cut off Karakova from the north, which is what's happening. But then in the south here, once they capture this area right here, I would actually just start pushing to the southwest here and try to reach this area right here, Andriivka, like this area right here, and cut off Karakov from the north, and then kind of link up with this direction. And then there's this giant Karakova pocket, as you can see here. So, and then the Russians could have a front line that is, pulls it up with Selidova. And then, So I think I think this is where the Russians will focus. So I think for this rest of this year up until the end of December, I think taking Karakova will be one of the main goals instead of Pokrovsk. I think the Russian command has a very big interest in trying to secure their flanks, because obviously they're, the southern part of, they were very worried about the north, they were very worried about the south, but now they've been having a lot of gains in this area. So, but that's just my prediction or my guess. And then also, there's been changes in the Kherson front. However, as I mentioned before, that the capture of Velika Novosilica, because this will become more easier as they do the encirclement of the Karakova pocket, because they'll be able to envelop it from the east. But but they also have to envelop it from the west, because just enveloping it from the east is not enough. The Ukrainians can still support Velika Novosilica from the west, but it looks like the Russians have plans for that, and the Russians are still improving their positions here. They have captured more fields along to the north towards Novi Darivka and actually have broken through from Stepova towards the small village of Oleshivka here and captured these fields here. It looks like they are trying to capture some sort of saying they have captured this village entirely. And again, it's one of those villages that have maybe like a few houses or something, so it's not really that big. Yeah, so a few houses or some shit. So, the Russians are trying to push Novi Darivka and Rovnopol. They're trying to push, towards Olesivka to try to improve their flank here. So it looks like they're trying to slowly but surely move northwards towards, where their positions were before the Ukrainian offensive last week. And, probably the goal is to take Novi Rovnopol and try to cut this road here and try to do something like this. Because then, when the Russians are here, right, then, they could then basically do what they did in Selidova and put a bunch of try to push towards and cut the last road in Olikhonovsovka and then force the Ukrainians away from that town. So yeah, a lot of gains in the south in that direction, lots of big gains, and this is where the main action is happening, and I think this is where the main action will continue to happen for the winter offensive. So yeah, let's continue watching this, and I'm excited to see where the Russians will go from here. Alrighty, let's now talk about the Toretsk and the Chasiv Yar Seversk direction. So there's been some changes on this front, but they are not as big, and I'm just gonna kind of put them all together. So first in Toretsk, we actually have some more clarifications of the front. So this residential area right here used to be under Russian control. However, we have geolocated footage of the Russians droning and bombing Ukrainian positions in this area still. So basically, this confirms that the Ukrainians are still in this residential area here, which is good for them because this greatly helps improve their positions in this mining area. And again, we talked about this before, but if the Ukrainians lose this giant mining fortress, then Toretsk falls because this is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold up to prevent the loss of Toretsk. But it's a very tough fight for the Russians here, But if the Ukrainians lose this, then it'll be a lot easier to take Toretsk. If the Ukrainians are still in control of this district right here, then this shows that the Russians are still that they have this place a bit more secure than we thought. The Russians are still making some slow progress towards the village of Chernobivka here. We saw the Russians move up a little bit north here, took a few more houses here, and are trying to take this village right here, just to try to encircle this mining area from the west here. So small gains along this, in Lodonovka into the southern part of Chernobivka here, but the Ukrainians are still holding on to this mine and are preventing the Russians from taking Toretsk. But I also think that the capture of Toretsk is another goal of the Russians for this year, and I think they definitely have the possibility of being able to take everything here in the next 2 months or so. So, but Toretsk is that, because once they take Toretsk, I talked about this last week, I think, when we were talking about Toretsk here, is that, the Russians want to also pull up their flanks in the north, just like they're doing in the south. And I'm pretty, one thing the Russians will probably try to do with the capture of Toretsk is move across this reservoir and try to take everything here, take this entire pocket and move the front line upwards. And what this will do is that, along with Chasiv, if Chasiv Yar falls, is that they could start battling for Konstantinovka. They could continue pushing northwards, break the Ukrainian defenses along this highway, and start trying to encircle Pokrovsk from the north as they move across these fields here. So, we shall see. But yeah, so that's Toretsk. There's some clarifications of the front. Also in Chasiv Yar, there's been some changes. We talked about how there's a breakthrough in the southern part of Chasiv Yar this week, or last week, I should say, where they captured this quarry in the south here, and basically this means that the battle to start encircling Chasiv Yar has begun. Chasiv Yar, again, has the high ground advantage and if the Russians take Chasiv Yar, they'll have the high ground advantage over everything in Konstantinovka, Drushbivka, Kramatorsk, and so forth. So we shall see how but they have to take Chasiv Yar, and in order to do that, they have to surround it. And last week they were in the southern part, and this week they are in the northern part. And we actually have some geolocated map changes that the Russians have completely captured what they call the Novi district, this area right here. They making small, steady gains here for the last few weeks, but now we have mappers saying they've completely captured this Novi district, and now the Ukrainians have fallen back to the center of Chasiv Yar here. Also, the Russians have started to capture this northern quarry, which is what they need to capture to encircle the Ukrainians in the Chasiv Yar from the north here. They have captured this part of the quarry, and because of that, they were able to capture this forest between Kalinova and the Chasiv Yar micro district in this Novi district here. So this gives them a solid foothold on the other side of the Seversky Donetsk Canal, as well as when the Russians broke through here, that they managed to have a foothold here as well. So basically, what this shows is that the Russians are trying to encircle Chasiv Yar, and maybe it looks like there's small steady gains. So I don't know if they're able to capture Chasiv Yar by the end of the year, but it's definitely on the occasion. And so right now the Russians are going to try to take these quarries and the village of Stupuchka here. They're going to try to capture the rest of this mining area here, and then when this happens, they could start encircling Chasiv Yar and putting the squeeze on it. So the Russians are now encircling Chasiv Yar from the north. They starting to encircle it from the south last week, and looks like the Russians are now finally activating Chasiv Yar direction after weeks of kind of rest and refitting after they reach the Seversky Donetsk Canal. There's also been no changes in the Seversk direction. This is still a very big question mark. We don't know. Russian sources are saying they have taken the village of Serebrenka, but we don't have any. We had a flag in Grigorka, but a lot of pro-Russians were saying actually no, they're So it's a big question mark. Like where exactly is the front here? So the Russians are definitely active here. They're keeping the Ukrainians pinned in Seversk, but we don't know exactly what's going on there. So we still need more geolocated confirmations and more footage. Now let's go to the Kupiansk-Liman direction, which is actually where a lot of interesting shit is actually happening this week. Let's talk about Liman first of all, where the Russians are still trying to clear the Ukrainians from the eastern part of the Zhirbets River. We have geolocated footage of the Russians taking the village of Nozadudovka here, this village right here, and this makes sense after the fall of Makivka and Nevsky. This was just a matter of time. They're just squeezing the Ukrainians from multiple directions, and they managed to take this village, and now it is Terny's turn. We have footage that the Russians have entered the northern part of Terny here. And so, we're going to see a repeat. This is probably what's going to happen in the next week or two. The Russians are going to be pushing north, and the Russians will be pushing in the south, and the Russians will be able to take Terny in the next few weeks, maybe even a week. The Russians are trying to clear this area of the Zhirbets River because not only does it give them a better defense position, that's basically the main issue. Now, the thing is, that does not mean that the Ukrainians also will because the Ukrainians have the high ground advantage here, and they also have a bunch of trenches like in this area because they're supposed to try to defend Liman, which is a big logistics hub for Donbass. But if the Russians could push the Ukrainians away here, they'll have a very good position to defend themselves here. And so if the Ukrainians in the future want to attack towards Kremenaya, it'll be a lot harder. So right now, the Russians in the Liman direction are here just to pin the Ukrainians down and clear the right bank of the Zhirbets River. And the captured Novozadovka and probably Terny and Yampolovka, it will be as a matter of time. In fact, the Russians are actually pushing and are now in the eastern outskirts of Torskoye. So there's battles for, they captured a few of these villages and are trying to battle for Torskoye. And so, the hope is to capture this village and then, Terny and Yampolovka. And probably in tandem with, if the Russians have broken through in the Seversk direction, they could probably finally finish the battle for the Shirbansky forest here and clear the Ukrainians that have built a bunch of trenches in this forest for the last 2 years. So, it's a big gain for the Russians, and the Russians will probably try to, level the front, something like this, and then, then the battle for Liman will probably start, but they'll probably try to wait off the third battle for Liman until they clear up this northern part of it, so they get assaulted from multiple directions. So yeah, lots of gains in the Liman direction. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of November we see Terny, Yampolovka, and Torskoye fall. But we shall still have to wait for but after that we shall see what the Russians will do. In the Kupiansk direction, the Russians are also making slow and steady but solid progress. The Russians have fully captured the village of Vishana here. After the capture of Stremaktivka, Mazeronovka, and Andriivka about a month ago, the Russians are now breaking through from these three villages and are now pushing. We saw the Russians capture this village, and we actually have apparently the Russians have raised their flags in the village of Peshachoronivka here. But this is something that came out today. So if it is true that the Russians have captured this village, then it is big news for the Russians, because at this point, then this is what the Russians could use this as a point to try to start encircling Borova, from probably try to get behind Borova as the Russians move to the north of it. So if the Russians have managed to try to capture this area, they can actually try to push the Ukrainians away from this area and finally take these two villages and completely continue the liberation of the Luhansk Oblast. But so the Russians are pushing the capture of Ashana. Sources are saying they have captured this village right here. Also, we have map changes that the Russians are pushing to the west here and have captured a bunch of fields to the west of Stomaktivka and are now reaching the village of Lozova, which they say they're about to storm soon. So if they manage to storm Lozova and capture it, then they'll be able to clear the fields between Pashana, Berestova, and this gives them a better, a lot more breathing room to support the Russian operations that are actually focused on, and last week one of the main specials was that the Russians have finally cut the Oskol defenses in half. So the Ukrainians that are in the Kupiansk direction are now cut off from the Liman direction. Now, they can still supply each other, obviously, but they have to go through behind, and they don't have a continuous front line on the right bank of the Oskol River. So, and the Russians here are still making solid gains. They are still in Kutrolinivka, which have been mostly captured. They have continued moving southwards toward the village of Zharodosa here, and they have actually moved northwards here as well towards the village of Klostolinivka here. So again, as I mentioned, the Russians are trying to make a solid foothold here, so that they could then expand southwards. Because I think that's where the Russians will focus on. I don't think they're going to focus on Kupiansk at the moment. So yeah, they are slow. They still have their positions here and have some small gains in this direction. They are pushing to the west of Stomaktivka and are slowly but surely trying to reach the Oskol River in the south here. And so lots of gains for the Russians here, and this will all bear fruit very soon. Not as sexy, obviously, as Salida or Gernik, but they're making the steps to be able to do that. And when they capture Borova, that will be a very good prize for the Russians, who have been having very little gains in this area for the last two. They've been capturing villages, improving their positions, but there's nothing like, we capture something very strategically significant, and Borova will be the first big prize for that. There's been there's been no changes in the Kharkov direction, and the Kursk direction we talked about how the Russians have launched their third Kursk offensive last week, and the Russians are now trying to solidify their gains here. However, this week was actually the week of the Ukrainian counterattacks. The Ukrainians have been trying to counterattack and prevent the Russians from encircling the Ukrainian troops that are in the northern part here. So if the Russians could clear, and so the Ukrainians really don't want to lose their positions in the north of Kursk here, and so they've been counterattacking here. So the Russians have taken these three villages, and the Ukrainians have been counterattacking this, tremendously. They've been trying to dislodge the Russians here and improve their positions here, and also unblock the Ukrainians that were encircled in the Tursky Luk area, and that they were too late. The Russians were able to liquidate this pocket here. So now the Ukrainians are trying to prevent the Russians from pushing through here and encircling the Ukrainian troops here, and undoing a lot more progress. But the Ukrainians have not been able to actually regain anything. So, the Ukrainians are making counterattacks to try to dislodge the Russians here, but it is it has probably slowed them down, but it has not actually dislodged them. And so, um, you know, right now the focus in the Kursk area is to try to encircle the Ukrainians that are in this northern part. And then after that, then the last battle will be the battle for Suchka. So, and obviously the Ukrainians don't want the Russians there. Now, one thing that's interesting is that we've been hearing a lot about the Russians using North Koreans, and my prediction is that the North Koreans will be used in the Kursk direction. And the reason for this is that the partnership that Russia and North Korea signed probably has provisions that say, hey, if if our sovereign territory is attacked, we want to we could support each other. And so with that, the so our and so for with that, Kursk is obviously internationally recognized as part of Russia, and so when the Ukrainians invaded, this allowed the North Koreans to help Russia clear up this, and they say they're saying they're sending about 12,000 troops, so that could be enough to try to tip the balance and actually take the town of Suchka back and fully restore the Russian-Ukrainian border. So. Yeah, so the battle for Suchka will probably involve a lot of Koreans. That is my guess. I don't think the Russians will be using the Koreans in Ukraine itself, but I could be wrong. But yeah, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Next week is the last week before the U.S. presidential elections. And it's the last week of October, and we are now deep in fall. We are at the tail end of fall. We are reaching winter itself soon. And so we shall see how the Russians and the Ukrainians continue trying to develop their, for the rest of this year. So yeah, be sure to like this video. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed my analysis and the updates that I've given for this week. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these videos, and comment your thoughts. Be sure to share this video around. So aim high and wander on.